Language awareness, tenses, and timelines. Before we start, a quick review on some useful terminology which you do need to know. These terms will come in useful when describing the verb form of any given tense. Ensure you are specific when identifying tenses. The word past is not enough to name the tense. It's always past something, either simple or continuous. Discuss with your partner now when we use these terms that you can see on the screen. Note in particular the difference in the words used for the past simple and past participle words. When do we use the latter? Also discuss with your partner the difference between the present participle, or the ing form of a verb, and a gerund, which is not mentioned here. They look the same, but are used for different purposes. What are they? If you have any questions about any of these, note them down and bring them up in your next OT. We traditionally tend to focus on form, i.e., the structure of a tense, but it is equally or more important to consider the use, or the meaning or function of the language. This becomes important when we need to explain why we use one tense or another. The next things to review are the following. Look over the following questions. You can refer to your pre-course booklet to help you review. What are the 3 types of verbs? What are the 3 principal auxiliaries? What are the 9 true modals? What are some semi-modals? Have a look at page 97 of the pre-course booklet if you have not yet seen the video on modals, and use this as a foundation for when you do cover them. Give a simple definition for each verb type and when we use them. List 5 functions. What's the difference between form and function? One form has many functions, and one function has many forms. Explain this in your own words. Pause the video and try to do this now. So the 3 types of verbs are main verbs, auxiliary verbs, and modal auxiliary verbs. The 3 principal auxiliaries are do, be, and have. What are the 9 true modals? They are can, could, will, would, shall, should, and may, might, and must. And some semi-modals are have to, ought to, and need to. Give a simple definition for each verb type and when we use them. Auxiliary verbs are used in conjunction with main verbs to mark time, aspect, or duration. They're also used to form negatives, questions, short responses, for example, yes I am, have you? And for emphasis, I do love you. Also in question tags, you've met John, haven't you? Modal verbs are used in conjunction with main verbs to modify their meaning and mark functions. For example, obligation, I must do this. Certainty, I will do this. Possibility, I could do this. Permission, may I do this, etc. Modality allows the speaker to introduce a personal interpretation of the non-factual and non-temporal elements of the event, action, process, or state. Whereas the main verbs are used for said action, process, or state. List 5 functions. There are many functions that you could list here, but some examples would be expressing ability, possibility, requests, giving advice, or expressing obligation. What is the difference between form and function? Well, form is what the language actually looks like and what its components are. So, for example, what auxiliary verbs are needed, if any? Is the third person s needed, etc. Function describes the speaker's intentions and attitude and what they actually want to do with the language. One form has many functions, one function has many forms. Explain this in your own words. One form can be used for several different functions. For example, the form, if something happens, something will happen. This can be used as a warning, advice, a plan, or a promise. One function can be expressed in several different forms. So, for example, for the function of giving advice, you could use the different forms you should, why don't you, or if I were you. So what are the contexts and functions of the following? Look at the sentences. Mummy, can I play with Sally after school? It could rain today. You should pay tax, or you must pay tax. I can play the piano quite well. Will you give me a hand? So the first one is the function of permission, possibility, obligation, ability, and a request. What verb forms do we find in the continuous tenses, the perfect tenses, and the perfect continuous tenses? Continuous verb forms always contain the auxiliary verb be, followed by the present participle, or ing, form of the main verb. But of course, depending on whether it is present, past, or future, you need to change the tense of the auxiliary verb to be accordingly, as you can see from the examples given. So present continuous would be, I am listening to Angie talk about continuous tenses. The past continuous would be, I was living a carefree life before I joined this course. The future continuous would be, I will be celebrating hard when this course is over. And what verb forms do we find in the perfect tenses? Perfect verb forms always contain the auxiliary verb have, followed by the past participle of the main verb. And again, depending on whether it is present, past, or future, you need to change the tense of the auxiliary verb to have accordingly, as you can see from the examples. Present perfect simple, I have learnt, or I've learnt, a lot since the course started. Past perfect simple, people had told me it would be a challenge. Future perfect simple, I will have accomplished so much by the time it finishes. And what verb forms do we find in the perfect continuous tenses? They can combine. Perfect continuous verb forms contain the auxiliary verb have plus been plus the present participle form of the main verb. The verb to have will change depending on whether it is present, past, or future, but there will always be been and the present participle in perfect continuous tenses. So, for example, present perfect continuous, my knowledge of tenses has been improving steadily. Past perfect continuous. Prior to the course, I had been living a life devoid of TESOL joys. Future perfect continuous. By the end of the course, we will have been learning about all things TESOL for 5 glorious months. Look at these different ways of expressing the future. What are the differences in attitude, and when is the decision made? So let's have a look at the uses. Present simple. I leave tomorrow. We've seen this function before. The present simple is often used to talk about facts. I leave tomorrow is on the timetable. It's scheduled. Going to. I'm going to leave tomorrow. There's an intention there on the part of the speaker, and the decision was made before the time of speaking. Present continuous. I'm leaving tomorrow. This is an arrangement, and perhaps more planned and with less personal involvement than the more intentional I'm going to leave tomorrow. Future simple. I'll leave tomorrow. This sounds almost spontaneous, like it was a decision made at the time of speaking. A good example I use to remember this is the scenario of when there's a knock on the door. People usually say, I'll get it, not I'm going to get it, or I'm getting it. Just as an aside, in our experience, students tend to overuse will as it's often the easiest form to remember and use. Just will plus the bare infinitive. For example, I will buy her a book for Christmas. Will you go to the pub tonight? Who will teach us tomorrow? So it's good to raise their awareness of the differences in these ways of expressing the future, using very clear contexts of when they would be used. And don't try to teach them all at once either. Now have a look at all these various examples of the present simple. Not so simple, it would seem. Discuss with your partner or group what the various uses or functions are for each of these examples. So the present simple can be used to express facts, or habitual actions, or a future, normally timetabled action, or a permanent long-term situation. Hopefully now you are starting to develop a sense of the difference between tense and time. Now it's your turn. In Part B, on page 1 of your task sheet, you'll see the same table as you see on the screen now. Work with a partner on this. Can you identify the tense and the use for each sentence? Pause the video and do this now, before you see the answers on the next slide. And here are the answers. So, with the same tense forms used for a variety of different functions or uses, or seemingly similar uses expressed using a variety of forms, how can we clarify concepts of tenses to our learners? Well, we can demonstrate, ask concept check questions, or elicit. Chat quickly with your partner or group, or think about how you can clarify some tenses using each of those 3 methods. But what is great for clarification, if done correctly of course, is drawing timelines. As timelines show our learners a very clear image of when things happen, we put some focus on this in the language awareness exam, so make sure you're comfortable with creating these. In the exam, you will have a number of sentences using different tenses, and you'll have to draw an accurate timeline exemplifying each sentence. In the following slide, you will see some examples of timelines, which correspond to page 2 of your task sheet. So have a look at these timelines. Look at the different symbols used in the timelines. How many can you identify? Pause the video and do this now. So in our timelines, we use the following: a straight line, a squiggly line, an arrow, and an X. You may also have noticed a question mark in the 11th timeline. Now, these symbols are not quote-unquote fixed. After this course, you can develop your own system if you feel an alternative one would serve you better. But during this course, we need to have an agreed code. You will see on the timelines themselves that we always indicate the past, now, with a big bold arrow to highlight this, and the future. We place the symbols somewhere along this continuum to show when the action is taking place. You will also see in the box some terminology you should try to use when discussing what these timelines mean. Is something a temporary or permanent state? Did the event happen at a specific or an unspecified time? Is it a continuous, interrupted, repeated, or single action or event? With your partner or group now, study and discuss these timelines and symbols. What tenses do they exemplify? Can you underline the whole verb form for each tense demonstrated? How do they illustrate the concepts? And, using some of the terminology at the bottom of the page, discuss why some of the timelines exemplifying the same tenses are different from each other, as in the case of numbers 1 and 7, 3 and 8, and 5 and 11. Let's start with identifying the tenses first. Let's do the first example together. I live in Hong Kong. So for this, we would underline live, because this is the word, specifically the verb, which tells you the tense it is in. Then, we identify what tense it is and write this down. So, I live in Hong Kong is in the present simple. Be careful. In the exam, and indeed in this very exercise, there may be more than one verb and more than one tense in one sentence. Ensure you identify them all. Pause the video and do this for sentences 2 to 11 now. When you've underlined and identified them all, resume the video. And here are the answers. Look carefully at what has been underlined for each example. Please note that unless the full verb form has been underlined in each example, you will not get a mark for this in the exam. For example, in sentence 2, I'm staying in mid-levels, it is imperative you underline the apostrophe M as well as staying, as this forms the present continuous am staying. If you only underline the present participle staying, you will not get a full mark, as this word alone does not indicate the present continuous. Same with sentence 4, will be working, sentence 5, have lived. Sentence 6, have been studying. Sentence 10, was walking. And 11, have been. Also note, as in the case of sentences 9 and 10, there are two verb tenses in one sentence. If you cannot identify both, you cannot be awarded the full marks for that question. Now let's look at all the timelines with symbols in common. Let's take the ones with the straight lines first, so sentences 1, 3, and 5. Pause the video and discuss with your partners now what is symbolized by a straight line. So you should have realized that the straight lines correspond to a state or a period in a simple tense. This is especially true of the verb live, as this is not a singular action or event, but more of a state. Note that these are all simple tenses, as opposed to continuous tenses. Now let's look at all the timelines with a squiggly line. What do you notice about when we use this symbol? So you will have noticed that squiggly lines are used for continuous tenses to show the ongoing and temporary nature of a particular action or activity. So what do all the crosses symbolize? Look at all the timelines that have these. Crosses symbolize single actions in simple tenses. So why do we use several crosses in question 7, but only one in question 8? Because the action in sentence 7, I get up at 7 o'clock every day, is a repeated action. Sentence 8, I met Bob in the bank, is a single action at a specified time in the past. Note as well how we could add the word yesterday underneath the cross to show exactly when it happened. Ensure you add specific times if they are mentioned when you draw timelines in the exam. Another potential area of confusion. Why, when we have the same tenses as in both these cases, the present simple, but we use different symbols? Pause the video and think about this or discuss this now. The reason is the tense may be the same, but the function is different. Sentence 1 is referring to a permanent period or state, whereas sentence 7 is referring to a repeated series of actions. You may remember we talked about one form, different functions. These different timelines highlight this. The present simple can be used either to describe a permanent period or state, or a habitual action, and depending on the context in which it is used, we can use a different timeline to exemplify the meaning. Same goes for sentences 3 and 8, which are both past simple forms, but exemplify different functions. One is a period or state in the past. I lived in Beijing for 2 years. And one is for a single action that happened in the past. I met Bob in the bank. Look at this example of the present perfect simple. What is the significance of the line with the arrow here? Pause the video and discuss this now. We use the line with the arrow because we know this event started 2 years ago and is still relevant to now. The arrow touching the now indicates that this state is still current. I have lived here for 2 years means that I still live here. Here's another example of the present perfect simple. So why are we using a cross here, and why is there a question mark near it? Pause the video and discuss this now. This is simply because we know these are completed events which happened sometime in the past in the person's experience, but we don't know when. These events happened at an unspecified time in the past. This symbol, a cross with a question mark, is only used for the present perfect simple describing ever type experiences. So just remember this. Now here's a little test for you. Look at sentence 2. I'm staying in mid-levels, which is in the present continuous. Note the squiggly line is over the now arrow. Here's a new sentence. I'm spending a few days with my family next week. Where does the squiggly line go now? And what would you write underneath it? You should have drawn the squiggly line here and written next week here. So don't assume that just because we are using the present continuous that it is happening now. Remember, a possible function of the present continuous is talking about planned events in the future, in which case, when we use a timeline, it is exemplified by drawing the squiggly line in the future and writing the words next week on the timeline so learners can see very clearly when this event is happening. So remember, one form has many functions. This is especially true of verb tense forms, as we have seen in previous examples. It's important to highlight here that when you start drawing timelines, it is of utmost importance to locate now clearly, so we can see where the action occurs. Timelines are used to locate verb forms in time in relation to now and in relation to each other. It's also very useful for the students if they put the actual verb form next to the symbols. If you are ever in doubt whether a timeline is effective, ask yourself, would it make the use clear to the students? Now it's your turn. On page 3 of your task sheet, you'll see some sentences where you have to underline the verbs or verb phrases, name the tense, and draw a timeline. This is what you'll have to do in the exam. Work through this now with your partner or group. Or if you do it on your own, ensure you check your answers with a partner afterwards. The answers will be posted before the next OT or upon request, but please do ensure you have tried them on your own first. So in this input, you've reviewed some terminology related to verb types, the 3 types of verbs and their functions, and the difference between form and function. You are developing a sense of the difference between tense and time. For example, the present simple and the present continuous can both also be used to express the future, as well as the present. You've looked at the different tenses and their forms and functions, seen corresponding timelines, and noticed that one tense does not always correspond to a particular timeline template, as their functions may differ and may require a different set of symbols. You've also worked on drawing your own timelines using the prescribed symbols, while identifying and underlining all the verb tense components in the sentences. In the next section, work with your group or partner to ask and answer any questions that you may still have after watching the video. Also refer to the pre-course reading or your own resources to fill in any gaps that you may have. Organize your notes and highlight the key information about everything you've covered in this input. Prepare your questions and any comments that you want to raise with your group for the next OT, or post them on the forum. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next OT.